Who or what is the audience? This is a big question in the history of rhetoric, or for anybody who composes oratory or writes for an audience. When you sit down to compose what it is you want to say, who is it you're imagining you're talking to, and where does that image come from? That audience that you're speaking to when you're putting a speech together, where do they come from? Did you just make them up? Are they part of your experience? Or are they some ideal listener or reader that you've made to make sure your arguments are of very high quality? Well, the 3 readings I've given you for public speaking for the next speech talk about this question of who or what is the audience. And you probably haven't thought much about this when you write papers for class. You might think the audience is your professor, or the audience is whoever's grading you, a teacher, someone like that. Maybe if you've written something for a journal, for poetry or literary magazine, you thought the audience might be other people who appreciate literature. Or maybe if you've written an op-ed or tried to send something to a newspaper, like a letter or an opinion column, you've thought, well, this is for everyone who disagrees with me. This is a kind of a natural thing that we do, but we don't put a lot of critical thought into how we come up with what those people are like and who they are. And these 3 readings help to do that. So this video's purpose is to get you to think about the questions for these 3 readings and then hopefully respond to them. If you're in the hybrid class when we meet in person, or if you're in the online class here on Discord, I'd like you to maybe give a little response if you can, if you have the time. So let's get into it. The first one on the list is by Edwin Black, who's a rhetorical scholar like me. Well, he's not like me at all. He's actually much cooler and smarter and more famous and better than me. Actually, we don't have anything in common at all. Yeah. Ed Black was very concerned that most people, when they were evaluating speeches, were only doing it based on some kind of a hermetically sealed criterion of quality, and that was the quality they were getting from Aristotle. Did speeches meet Aristotle's rules for good speech? And although we haven't read that in this class, the question still remains is, how do you know a speech is good? And how do you know if a good speech maybe might have bad effects or bad impact on the way that people think? In his essay, Second Persona, Ed Black takes on this challenge by saying that efficacy is not the only way that we can evaluate speech. We also must evaluate efficacious speeches, that is, speeches that work, speeches that persuade, speeches that move us. We must also evaluate them on moral and ethical grounds, meaning, are they good speeches in that sense? Not simply do they work, but do they promote the good or the ethical? Do they treat people in a way that makes sense, that is right, that is just and fair and good? And that's what ethics is in a very short version of it, not from an ethicist or anyone like that. Ethics and morals are very important because you want to treat other people as human beings, as people worth speaking to, as people whose opinions matter and whose assent matters. A lot of times when we think about political speech or we think about speaking to people, we don't really think their opinion matters. We think they're stupid, and we just need to trick them to get them to come along to what we want to do. You can see what this attitude has done to politics in the United States. The attitude that people are dumb, they don't know what's best, we're going to have to manipulate them and say what they want. Now we have a full-blown civic crisis on our hands where persuasion is the last thing anyone wants to do. Everyone wants to confront people with what they think the facts are, and then if they don't agree, they want to cancel them or silence them. This isn't how to run any kind of democratic order, even a fake one like this one. Black says we need to think about speeches as calls to be something, not just agree with something. So my questions to you are, what does he think is the best way to evaluate a speech? The second thing is, what advice does he have for you when you're imagining who it is you're speaking to? And the third thing is, what are the dangers that Black talks about in terms of using metaphor and using things inappropriately just to get what you want from the audience? What happens? What's the result of that? What are the bad things that can result? So think about that when you read that essay for class. The second essay that I'm having you read is Ralph Ellison's essay, which is from around the same time. I think it's 1972 in the American Scholar, and Ed Black is writing in 1970, so this is kind of on people's mind. His essay, The Little Man at Chehaw Station. Ralph Ellison is, of course, one of the most famous American critics, writers, and thinkers that we've ever had in the United States. And he's most famous for writing the novel Invisible Man, which is an amazing novel about race in 1950s America. In this essay, he talks about audience and who he thinks he's writing to when he sits down to write a novel or to write a story or pretty much anything. Little Man at Chehaw Station is Ralph Ellison's understanding of the American audience. He starts as a student at the Tuskegee College and how he played a concert at the train station there, and he kind of mailed it in because he didn't think anyone was paying attention. Well, his instructor really nailed him for that and said, "You underestimated your audience." Why? Because there's always a little man who is in the audience, a little man hiding behind the stove who knows the tradition and he knows the culture and he knows it better than you, and he's going to call you out on it and judge you for being less than you actually are. So this is kind of a parable or a story about what it means to underestimate the audience. Ellison uses the comparison of a vending machine or jukebox. You can't just hit the combination of letters and numbers and expect the song you want to come out of the American audience. Much too complex for that. He has a great section where he talks about the difference between accepting the melting pot theory of American culture, which has been under a lot of criticism lately. I think you probably have good criticisms of that idea as well. And the alternative for him, which he calls blood magic. I want you to pay careful attention to this section because it has a lot to say about our current situation in public speech and persuasion for us in the United States. The question I'd ask you here is, what things do you see in the Ellison essay that have come true, and what things do you see that we could work on to improve our public speaking and communication situation now, according to what Ellison suggests? Another big question is, what is the American audience for Ellison? And I think you find two examples of that in the essay that can help you speak to how do we take in this audience. The first is his experience on Riverside Drive, where that crazy dressed guy gets out of a car and takes the 1960s equivalent of a selfie in front of his crazy car. And you look at all the intersection of all the different cultures and styles and attitudes in that. It's a really wonderful scene and really funny when you think about it, about how what his reaction must have been. But what do you make of that? Is this what the American audience is? Do we have the freedom to pull in whatever cultures and whatever technology and whatever practices we want from other cultures? Or are there limits on that? Are there limits to the kind of attire that we can wear? Are there limits to the kind of style that we can emulate? And what do you think American audiences think about that? Hopelessly intersected ad infinitum down a rabbit hole of accessible global culture because of the power of international markets, is I think that example what it says to me. The second example is the one where he's working for the WPA and he goes to the housing project and hears the men shouting at each other violently, and then hears them shouting and cursing at each other violently about who the best soprano at the Met is. Now, how did these men gain access to that? Well, through accepting the stereotypes of how they look. They look like really good Egyptian slaves on stage. So they go down there, they make, 40, 50 bucks. They're an extra at the Met, and then they get to hear the best music in the world. So they were probably better equipped to comment on the quality of sopranos than a lot of people in the audience because they've just seen so many. They've seen so many different kinds. So that's another one too. So for Ellison, what does it mean to underestimate the audience? And how do you make sure you're not underestimating the audience? What advice does he give to us to make sure that when we address Americans, addressing an American audience, for him specifically, what do we need to keep in mind? What mistakes can we make, and what's the way to do this properly? The last essay is from Chris Tyndale, and it's about the universal audience and how to construct a universal audience. Universal audience theory is very controversial. A lot of people don't accept it and don't like it, but most people don't understand it. What the universal audience is an inductively constructed theory about how we write and how we speak, to begin with. Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht-Titica wrote this book in the 1950s called The New Rhetoric. It was a masterwork of argumentation and rhetoric studies, but it's kind of ignored because it's kind of confusing here. But I think that the way that this should be interpreted is that they are making an inductive account of some of the rhetoric theory of the past to say, what does it really mean if we say that speeches are good if they're addressed to the audience? They say that when people come up with reasons, they often make a distinction between persuading and convincing. If they say something persuaded them, they say it might not be universal, that it might not be reasons for everyone. But if they say something is convincing, they most likely mean that anybody who encounters it might find it convincing. And they operationalize this into the universal audience, which is the idea that when you sit down to create a piece of rhetoric, something persuasive, you imagine an audience that would be, whoever they would be, they'd be convinced by what you have to say. They would understand it, and they would find it persuasive, and they would be moved by it. Now that's a very tall order, and it also kind of leads us to kind of homogenizing the audience. But what it does is avoid a criticism that they received, which is that they were happy to have speeches be evaluated on pandering, which is, well, whatever the audience wants, give it to them. But that's been the critique of rhetoric for thousands of years, and that's been the philosophical critique of rhetoric in specifically in analytic philosophy, and also in Platonic-based philosophy. All of Western philosophy has critiqued rhetoric for not being interested in the discovery of truth, but only in the discovery of efficacious means. Perlman and Ulbricht are philosophers themselves of the European tradition, so they understand this critique really well. And they say the universal audience checks back on this, because what you are doing is you're not imagining arguments that you prefer, but imagining arguments that the best kinds of thinkers that you can imagine in your social and cultural situation would prefer. How do you make sure that you're imagining good people? You think in terms of, okay, this is an argument that would appeal to someone who's a person, not necessarily like me, but they recognize these things about the world. It doesn't have to be absolutely true or factual. It's like, what's their sphere of reference? It pushes you to really imagine what life is like for other people and what arguments would jump between specific instances to persuade people. The universal audience is also something that he talks about a little bit in detail in Acts of Arguing, about times when it was not functional, when it wasn't used properly, and we made big mistakes because we made arguments that really were attractive to the particular audience. So for Tyndale, what I want you to think about is, what's the universal audience? How would I define that? How would I use this when composing a speech? And the final question is, what happens if I don't? What are the dangers of only speaking to the audience that I think is there? I think if you read these three pieces and you think about those questions, you'll be in good shape to really further your understanding of audience for speech 2. I think in speech 2, I'd like to see you guys think more about the audience and not just write something you think would appeal to me or something you think would appeal to you or other students in the class, but try to think of arguments that might appeal to a much broader audience, or whoever it is you imagine out there is listening to you, because it's not everybody. There are reasonable ways to discount people out of your audience that you wouldn't want to speak to. But what are those reasons? And how do you know you're making good ones? How do you know you're not just expressing your preference to do an easier job at persuading? When ethical persuasion, for Perlman and Ulbricht and for Tyndale, would require some kind of construct beyond yourself and beyond the immediate audience to check back any tendency where you'd want to trick them or do something you know that they'd accept but other audiences wouldn't accept. That's the ethical line of the universal audience. Well, that's the best explanation I can give in this short video for those three pieces. If you want to talk to me more about that, you can Skype me, or you can contact me on the Discord. Happy to talk to you in depth about any of these essays or what they mean. I hope you read them, and I hope that we get a good conversation going on Discord about them between the two classes. So when you have a question or something you want to say about one of the readings, just put it on Discord and we'll talk about it there. Or you can email me, or you can Skype me, and I'm happy to explain anything confusing to you. Because it's my job, people. That's what I'm here to do.